Welcome to Power the Network. I'm your host, Tim Locker, Vice President of Broadband for CBM. Today, we're going to continue on with our conversation with Chris Kurtz, talk a little bit more in the power utility industry, some of the new technologies, and what's going to happen here in the future. So let's get right back into our conversation with Chris. Talk to me about DERMS. It's a distributed energy resource management system. That's way above my head, obviously, but tell me a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, utilities love their acronyms, right? And so there are a ton of acronyms. So it goes back to the system we talked about a little while ago. Traditionally, electric systems were one way. Start at a power plant, go through transmission, substation, distribution, end up at a home or at a business.
Okay.
And you had one source of power. Whether it may have been nuclear power, it may have been coal-fired power, gas-fired, or a dam providing hydropower, but it was always one source that fed one direction down through that system. The world of today and tomorrow, there are multiple sources at multiple places on that system to provide power into it. And so now, besides just having a coal-fired power plant down here at the end, you might have wind generation that's not at the end, but in the middle of that system. You might have a solar panel on somebody's house or a car, an EV, that's plugged into someone's house, and now power's feeding back into that system. Each one of those sources is different in its own right.
Yeah.
You know, solar's different than wind, different than coal, and they all have their own advantages, cost advantages, and efficiency advantages. And those vary over time. I mean, wind is very efficient when the wind's blowing, but it's not other times. Solar's very efficient when the sun's out, and not at other times. What happened traditionally is utilities used what they called an EMS system, or an energy management system, to control that power flow from the generator all the way down to the customer. But an EMS system doesn't have the ability to look at all the new inputs that are coming in, providing power into that system. And so that's what's led to the DERMS system. And what the DERMS systems will do for a utility is they'll look at any given moment in time and determine whether wind's the best source of power, whether coal is, whether nuclear is, and whichever one's the best source of power, they will close the breakers, make the connection they need to bring that source of power onto the system. Well, 5 minutes later, it might be different. And so they may switch over to and it's probably not 5 minutes, but at some point, one of those other sources become more efficient, and so they switch over to solar, or they switch over to biomass, or they switch over to coal or gas or whatever it is. And so it's a very complex control system that takes multiple resources and determines which one needs to feed into the system to make the lowest cost for the utility and ultimately the customer, electricity and power into that system.
So when we hear the term smart grid,
right,
that's exactly what we're talking about.
That's exactly what you're talking about. Smart grid, and you'll hear about smart grid, you hear about smart neighborhoods these days, even smart cities, and those are areas that have determined that they don't want just one source from the utility. They may put in their own solar, they may put in their own wind turbines, and then hook to the utility, and whichever one is the most efficient and cost effective, they'll feed their neighbors or their city or whatever it is with that source during that period of time.
Okay. So, technology-wise, smart grid, all these different controls, are we seeing a different use of fiber optics today in the utility space?
Oh, definitely. I could take you out to spaces around here that wouldn't even think of having fiber in them. Substations, for example. Yeah. You're starting to see fiber put throughout substations where 5 years ago it didn't exist at all. Because fiber is a much more effective way to communicate from point A to point B, right? I mean, it's got low losses. You can transmit a lot more over a little wire than you could. So you go into a typical large power substation, they'll typically run control wires from the devices out around the substation to the central control, whether that's a house, a control house, or whatever it is. They would run that with number 10 and number 12 wire, big bundles of 12 conductor number 10 or whatever it is. I mean, gigantic things. things. Now, all of those smart devices that are going into substations have fiber associated with them. And now you take one small fiber cable and you can take it out to all of those devices and have one cable that feeds back into the control house. So that cuts down on the cost of all of the work you have, civil work you have to do to create cable troughs and duct work. And you replace it with single cables running out to these devices. That's just one example in the electric utility, but you're seeing it everywhere. As a matter of fact, every time they put up a large transmission line, which are the big lines you see going across the country, they'll put a fiber optic cable up in the top of that thing in what we call the static wire.
Optical ground wire.
Optical
OPGW.
ground wire, that's right, to connect one end to the other of all of that. And they'll use those wires for the protective relaying that they have to protect that transmission line from faults or, whatever might occur to it. But then they'll also take some of that dark fiber and they'll let their neighbors, they won't let them, they'll let them pay to use that dark fiber.
Agreement
that's right.
That
to use it for communications or whatever purpose they may need. So fiber is a growing, fiber is getting big in utilities and will continue to do so.
And obviously that's been my background. I've not got a lot of experience in the utility space, but I do have a lot of experience in fiber. And, OPGW has been around a long time, but, we're starting to see, in the REC market and co-ops, et cetera, doing a lot of fiber to the home, maybe not so much fiber to the home in a generation type of public utility.
Right.
But, those easements are very valuable.
Yep.
And that's also, like you said, you can make an IRU agreement. And so we're starting to see a little bit more of that where the power utilities are, seeing the value and the opportunity for, different deals there.
I agree.
With you, Will.
I agree. It's a revenue source that they didn't traditionally have.
Yep. Yeah. If you've got an easement across, a great span,
right.
Somebody wants to be there.
No doubt.
So, there's been a lot of mergers in the utility space recently. Do you expect more of them in the future? How does that affect the customer, the end user? We've seen different rate change plans and, based on peak rate, et cetera.
Right.
How does all this affect us as an individual end user of the utility?
Well, let's start with merger and acquisitions. What you've seen in that arena has mostly happened in the IOUs or the investor-owned utilities. You haven't seen that to the same degree in the co-ops or the REAs, and certainly not in municipals. But the reason that happens is economy of scale. And it's happened enough. Well, let me just give you a statistic. 20 years ago, there were 148 investor-owned utilities in the country. Today, there's less than 42.
Oh, wow.
Because there's mergers happening all the time. So, and they will continue to happen. And so the reason always given is just the economy of scale. So you bring two utilities together, especially two that are geographically close to each other, right next to each other. And so that those two operating areas become one operating area. And while you still have to have a lot of linemen to cover those two areas, you still have to have a lot of substation folks, technical folks to do that. You can combine the legal groups, you can combine the HR groups, the accounting groups, all of those, back office groups, and you can scale down. The other thing you can do is when you go to manufacturers to buy equipment, now instead of buying it as a single utility where you may buy 20 of whatever this is, now as two utilities, you might buy 40 of that, and so you'll get a better price on that. So you put all of that together, and it creates an economic model where it makes sense to bring those companies together into a single utility.
Are those typically a friendly deal, or are they
yes
not
and
hostile?
No?
Can be hostile.
Yes and no. Some of those are takeovers.
Yeah.
Some of those are hostile mergers. Some of those are friendly mergers. The ones I've been associated with a takeover and been associated with a friendly merger. Well, actually, it was a takeover that didn't get approved and became a friendly merger. But and there's
obviously some risk to the employees, especially the redundant groups.
There definitely is. What the customers though see, and this has been proven time and time again, is you look over a 5-year window after those mergers, and customers have been impacted positively by that. Now, I'm not saying
If the
rates,
company can bring their costs down, then
right? And so,
ultimately
and it doesn't necessarily mean that their rates are going to go down, but what it means is the rates don't go up as much as they would have outside of that merger. So it helps the customer from that perspective to understand that. When it comes to like time of use rates, you mentioned that.
Sure.
That's a very common thing in the electric utility space these days. And that goes to efficiency around peak. So we've talked about peak, what peak is. And peak is that moment of time, whether it's the middle of the summer where everybody has their air conditioners on, the middle of the winter where everybody has their heat pumps on. Those are normally the two peaks you see in an electric utility. At that point, that is when the most electricity is needed at any instant throughout the year. And an electric utility has to size its generating fleet, so all of its power plants,
Yep.
for that very moment. So when you flip that switch on, you're that last person, right, that's turning their switch on there. If you don't have enough generation, enough power plants making power to cover that switch flipping, then the lights don't come on for that person. Well,
Yep.
that's really bad for everybody.
Yep.
And so what that means is they have to build enough generation, have enough power plants to cover that, and then the regulators make them usually cover at least 20% more than that.
A little bit
So,
extra.
Yeah, you got to have extra on that. And so when they're looking at planning for the future, not only to replace old power plants, but what are the new power plants when things like EVs are now coming on and that peak is going to jump
Yeah.
up? Well, that means now over here, 10 years down the road, we're going to have to build a new power plant. And those power plants, especially if they're nuclear, can be billions of dollars to build. And who pays for that? Well, the customers pay for that
Yeah.
over the next 40 years or whatever. And so utilities are being encouraged by the federal government, by regulators, to help customers understand that and then help customers help keep that peak down as much as they can. So if you're now not doing your laundry at the same time everybody else is doing their laundry, when the air conditioners are running, that peak will be lower. And if that peak stays low enough, the utilities say, I may still have to build a power plant, but instead of 10 years, it's now 20 years away. And so it allows them to put off those big capital investments that then flow to the customers through rates. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that helps a lot. All right, real quick, let me tell you a little bit about what we do here at CBM. So we're a manufacturer's rep located here in the Midwest. We work in 3 different vertical markets, utility space, we work in communications, and also commercial industrial markets. We've been in business since 1960, been an employee-owned ESOP since 1988. We really value that employee ownership in our organization, and I think it brings a lot to value our manufacturers as well. So if we can be of any service to you and help you in your next project, or if you're a manufacturer looking for expert representation, feel free to reach out to us here at CBM. That's cbmrep.com. Let me ask you this too, just real simple then. So in terms of the cost of power, when it's if it's at the peak, does that power cost more than to generate?
It really
as
does,
well?
because what happens is we talked a little bit ago about base load generating plants. So base load generating power plants are the ones that utilities have on all the time to provide power, because they're the ones that they can produce power the cheapest. And those tend to either be nuclear or, and we don't have a lot of hydro, so they tend to be either nuclear or coal power plants. They produce the cheapest amount of power. So you're going to run them all the time for just regular power. But as that peak starts to climb in the middle of the summer, right, those can't handle it. There's not enough power being produced by them to do that. So utilities will have smaller peaking power plants, and many of those are either run by natural gas or by fuel oil or something like that, which is pretty expensive to produce power with. So you don't use it all the time, but you use it during those peaks. And because you're using the more expensive sources during that time, it makes that power during those peaks more expensive to generate, to create.
And that was my assumption too. But so how much advance notice do you have for these peaks?
For the peaks.
Obviously, they're monitoring this stuff
Right.
24/7 all the time. But, in May, as the air conditioners kind of kick on one by one, is it a slow thing, or does it ever just boom, hit all at once and catch you off guard?
So normally it's a slow thing. Normally, and utilities track that peak every year. They're required to, but they do anyway. And they plan their next summer based on what the peak was last summer or winter, depending on the peak that they're dealing with. And so they know, given these conditions, that's why when they're going to take a power plant down to do maintenance, they don't do it anywhere near that time. They do it in the middle of the early spring or late fall or something like that to do maintenance because there's less chance you're going to have one of those peaks.
Okay.
The last one, but there are surprises. The last thing that really surprised utilities was that winter vortex that came through a couple of years ago, because you go down to Texas, and what happened in Texas was not only did the wind and the solar and they have a lot down there, not only was it a cloudy period of time and the wind wasn't where it needed to be, but they'd also taken down a couple of their nuclear power plants for maintenance because normally it would be fine to do.
Yeah, so they're offline.
They're offline, and all of a sudden they're having rolling blackouts because there's just not enough power being produced, and they can't bring it in from other utilities because all the other utilities are having the same problem, right? Because that hit the whole center part of the country when that happened. So surprises happen very seldom. And I can tell you that regulators, since that vortex, have changed mandates around when power plants can go down for maintenance and when they can do other construction work that limits power flow to overcome that type of thing in the future. And so they continue to evolve their rules and regulations around it.
Okay. Let's change the subject a little bit. So you've been with us for about a year now with CBM, and we're grateful to have you. How is it for you now on the other side of the fence, in a sales role versus, in your director level or management role there with the utility?
Well, I didn't think it was going to be very different, but I was wrong. I can tell you when I was on that side of the fence, I didn't think twice about going to somebody at CBM because, the company I worked at had a long relationship with CBM, and asking a question about something. It may not have even been that important to me, but I needed to know about a piece of equipment or test equipment or whatever, and I had a question about it. And I was always expecting a quick answer. And when I wouldn't get one, I'd get a little frustrated at those,
what's the deal?
Those guys. What in the heck's going on here? Yeah. And what I found out on this side is there is a lot that goes on behind the scenes to answer those questions, whether it's multiple email conversations or voice conversations with manufacturers, and then manufacturers may have to ask, sub-manufacturers, there's just a lot that goes into answering questions and doing the legwork that it takes to make the customer happy, whether that customer is a big one or a little one. We treat them all the same, right? And so you want to get the right answer for them in a timely fashion so they can make good decisions. Yeah. And I just never realized how much work goes on this side of the fence. So I appreciate that much more now than I did.
Yeah, no, that's great. So what's one assumption that people make about your job that's not true?
Well, okay, so there was always this image at electric utilities, and big ones anyway, that these manufacturer reps, all they did was go to lunch and play golf.
I mean, you go to lunch.
And that is definitely not true. I haven't played golf in 9 months I've been here, I got to tell you. So it is, there's some time, you got to have relationships, right? And you got to spend time with your customers and develop those relationships, but there's a lot of work that goes on. It's not easy. There's a lot that goes into it. When you look at, we're working on a project right now to bring a major piece of equipment into a utility that's never had this equipment from this manufacturer. And I've been here 9 months, and we've spent 8 months and 2 weeks working on this.
Yeah.
And involved multiple trips to the manufacturer, multiple trips out to the field, to people that are already using this equipment to see how they like it and how it works. And then starting to work on partnership agreements and working with the procurement group at the company in order to get all the T's and C's, right, and everything. And so it is not a straightforward process, and it is not an easy process.
Yeah,
to do
nothing's
something.
Easy, nothing's quick.
Right.
But it is very enjoyable, isn't it?
No doubt. And the thing I love about it is the relationships, right?
Yeah.
So one thing I love about CBM is CBM I always had a great relationship when I worked at the utility there, had for 38 years I was there, as a matter of fact, in the substation group, because CBM has been around 60, and they've been dealing with the utility I was at for my 38 years. And so working with CBM during that period of time, the relationships were always the strongest thing. And you would like to think it's all, whether a utility is going to purchase some piece of equipment, is all about bottom line cost, or it's all about, a service agreement. It's really about those kind of things. But it's much more about the relationship, because I need to be able to trust you.
Yeah, you got to be able to count on someone that's going to do what you ask.
That's right.
Follow through in the end.
And then if something does go wrong, be there to support me as my
Yeah.
ally.
How are you going to take care of the issues when we have it?
And so it's the thing I love most about this is relationships, and forming those. Even with some of the new people, I didn't know when I was working at the previous utility I was at. So it's great. There's utility people are good people, right? And the one thing, especially about linemen, I thought was always funny was that linemen will normally have a second job. They'll normally be a farmer. They'll normally
a lot of cattle
be
guys.
That's right. And they would
guys.
always tell me when I was working at this utility that their second job was really the utility, right? Their primary job was out on the farm or doing whatever they do. But that's the kind of mentality you want working for you at a utility, someone with that kind of work ethic that's going to get the job done. And as a manufacturer rep, we need to have that same kind of attitude. We need to be able to go the mile, go past the mile for the customer and create that relationship that's going to last.
Yeah. Well, it's always fun. I share the same thing that, my favorite part of this job is relationships. Customers turn into friends over the years. And you're going to go to the end of the earth for them. And that's really what matters at the end of the day.
I agree.
Well, Chris, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on with us today. We're grateful to have you here at CBM. We hope you stick around a long time.
Well, I really appreciate being here. I didn't know what it was going to be like being on this side of the fence, but now I've been here 9 months. I'm really starting to love it.
No, you're going to kill it. We appreciate it.
All right, thanks.
All right, that was great. We're truly fortunate to have Chris as part of our team. He's an absolute wealth of knowledge in the power utility space, and we're grateful to have him. If you have any questions from today's episode, feel free to reach out to us here at CBM at cbmrep.com. And thanks again for joining us on Power the Network.